Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephanie Bruton. I'm the president of the Royal Society, and I'm going to start by, well, first of all, of course, welcoming everybody who is here. But I'm also going to start and be very brief because depending on where you are, we are all exposed to load shedding, and in where I am, in Stellenbosch at the moment, it's going to start at 6 o'clock. So I'm just crossing fingers that everything holds until then, and that we don't have any hitches. So let me start by saying welcome to those who are here, and particularly to Professor Mike Bruton, who is going to speak this evening, and to other members of the Royal Society Council and some familiar colleagues who I'm delighted to see online. Particularly some long-standing colleagues for me from my own institution. I also want to welcome new members of the Royal Society who have joined recently. Dr. Ansel Falsch from Northwest University, Dr. Helen Fukwa from University of Stellenbosch, Mr. Anil Lonapan from Mangosuthu University of Technology, Terence Kamal, who is an extraordinary professor at Northwest University, and Mr. Linton Munyai, who is a student at the University of Venda. And in particular, I'm very, very happy to welcome all of those new members who come from universities that we don't have very many members from. So it's a real pleasure to see that we are spreading our wings a little and including other universities. This evening, the talk that we have scheduled is co-hosted between the Royal Society and the Academy of Sciences of South Africa. And it is a real pleasure to welcome back to give this lecture, Professor Mike Bruton. Professor Bruton has been a speaker for us a few times, and he is well known to many of us as a long-standing member of the Royal Society and also as a long-standing member of our scientific community. He is retired now as an aquatic scientist and spends his time, he says, thinking and writing and giving talks and hiking and so on. You will have read the small introduction that we had in the invitation. But Mike has also been a long-known protagonist or enthusiast for bringing science to the community, to the public. And in fact, he's been recognized by the Royal Society and the National Science and Technology Forum for his communication of science. And he is also a writer. He has written a number of books. And this evening, he is going to talk to us about his latest book, which is entitled Harambee, Spirit of Innovation in Africa. And that is his topic for this evening. So Mike, we are really looking forward to hearing what you are going to tell us about it. And please don't forget to tell us where we can find copies of your book in due course, so that if we can read the whole thing. So Mike, over to you. Thank you so much for being prepared to give us this talk. Mike, if you could just unmute.
Can you see the slide?
Yes, yes, we can.
Right. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's great to be sharing some ideas with the Royal Society again. As Stephanie said, I'll be speaking about the topic of my latest book, Harambee, the Spirit of Innovation in Africa. Harambee is a Swahili word. It's actually the motto of Kenya, which I regard as one of our most innovative countries in Africa. And it basically means let's pull together, let's work together. Interestingly, the motto of arguably the most innovative state in the USA, California, is Eureka, so also related to innovations. Now, What I've attempted to do in this book, is bring together information on African inventions, but it is by no means an encyclopedic treatment. That would have to be done by a multinational, multi-author team over a period of years. I only had 2 years to write this book, plus everything else I was busy on. And I also had a word limit of 130,000 words from my publisher. So what I've had to do is sort of cherry pick inventions which I think are representative of what's happening in African countries. And the book covers some 800 of them by 600 plus innovators from 50 African countries. But I must emphasize this is not comprehensive at all. Oddly enough, in my reviewing of the literature, I found very few books that attempt to review innovation as a whole throughout the continent. In fact, not one that I would say does the same as this book attempts to do. There are some books with a few chapters on aspects of technology, but none that deal with it entirely. Now, I have a particular interest in indigenous knowledge and traditional ways of doing things. And as a result, my view of what innovation is about is probably a little bit biased. So, you know, those of you who are expecting ultra high-tech things that you can buy for your smartphone, or the intricate workings of, you know, nuclear power stations, that's not really what I've concerned myself with in this book. Because from my reading, and especially my discussion with African innovators, I realized that there are all three levels of technology are exploited in Africa: low, medium, and high. And in particular, low and medium technology are of great importance in helping people, African people, to improve their quality of life and their economic situation. So this slide shows some Africa first, mainly in the traditional technology field, and you can see many of them are pretty obvious, and many of you will have knowledge in these fields. Just to touch on one of them, fire, of course, is not something that had to be invented by humans. It's a natural thing. But the controlled use of fire can be regarded as a vital tool in the development of humankind. Not only did it provide heat, warmth in your cave or hut, but the means of cooking and preserving your food, of melting gums and eventually melting metals, and making tools, as well as making tools to make tools. And the evidence for the earliest controlled use of fire has been found in Southern Africa, both at Sterkfontein and also in Northern Namibia by Professor Bob Brain and his collaborators. So that's an example of very early technology. And of course, Homo habilis, handyman, developed a variety of tools, starting with bone, shell, and ivory tools, and leading on to the use of metal. Interestingly, one of the technologies that goes back furthest in time is fishing technology, because fishing is one of the earliest forms of hunting, and it doesn't require the same sophistication as hunting on land. Fairly simple apparatus can be used to catch fish and shellfish, which provide protein as well as income. In fact, there are cave paintings from over 45,000 years ago showing fishermen using pretty sophisticated technology. Tomb paintings in Egypt, as shown in the lower two slides here, also illustrate amazingly advanced technology used for fishing, including bent hooks made from shell and bone and thorns, nets made from plant material. And in the top two slides, I've shown examples of the sort of modern equivalents. On the top left are some fish hooks made from the thorns on the Ilala palm near Mosambique in Mozambique. And top right is a simple fishing reel made from natural wood near Vilanculos. And the amazing thing about fish traps and other fish catching apparatus is that they have been used for centuries and they continue to be used today. And I hope they will continue to be used long into the future because they're designed to harvest aquatic resources in a sustainable way. And this is in sharp contrast to so-called modern gear, which over-harvests the resource and limits its life. And just to give a few examples, this is Isifonia fishing with the thrust basket in the Pongola River floodplain in northern Zululand. And there you can see this woman has already caught a number of sharp-toothed catfish hanging from her belt. But sadly, this method of fishing is almost extinct now. And I argue in my book that it's just as important to conserve the traditional methods of fishing that use resources sustainably as it is to conserve the fishes and shellfishes themselves. When I lived in Zululand, these Fonia drives were participated in by hundreds of people. Now it's just a few dozen, and probably within a decade, it'll disappear completely. Here's another example of a traditional method, a constriction trap where the fish basically swims into the trap, typically placed in a rapid, and they're caught at the bottom end. And the slide at the bottom right shows various snout fishes being caught in a constriction trap. Here in Zanzibar, the so-called Madeira foldable valve traps, which are used to catch fish as well as crabs, are an example of a method that is very effective. And something alarming that's been found recently in regard to fishing is the impact of ghost fishing. In other words, the amount of fish and shellfish that are caught once gear has been lost or abandoned. And some estimates predict that the catch from ghost fishing could be as high as the commercial catch that we're actually landing. And the advantage of these Madeira traps made from plant fiber that will eventually decompose if they're lost at sea is that they don't carry out ghost fishing. Another problem we have, the replacement of so-called modern gear or traditional gear, is the use of mosquito nets, either as seine nets or to line traps, as these scenes in Botswana show. And these nets are absolutely devastating because they have a very fine mesh, but they're also impregnated with insecticide. Now, fortunately, there are some traditional fisheries that have continued to survive. This is the Zimbabwe floating village in Malawi near Lake Chilwa. And these people spend half the year on the water and harvest the fish sustainably. And here are some slides of the development of fishing craft: a bark canoe, top left, a canoe or a raft made from the fronds of a raffia palm, the top right, a traditional dugout canoe with outriggers, and then a sailing clinker built dhow. And even canoes have been upgraded in terms of technology. In the Okavango Delta in Botswana, they basically run out of trees that are large enough to make dugout canoes. So these are exact replicas made from fiberglass that are now used. And how is this for innovation? This fisherman in northern Angola has used this wingtip fuel tank from an F-84 Thunderjet that crashed during the Angolan War and made a rather precarious looking canoe for himself. Here's another example of a traditional fishing method that used to be very effective, but is sadly now completely extinct. These fishermen fished from a mbulu or dark hut with a 6-meter long spear, and they were able to catch fish swimming past. Back in the 50s, there were over 250 of these mbula huts along the Kafue Flats in Zambia, but sadly, they've completely disappeared. Right, to move on to some other low-tech innovations in the Sahel of Africa, stretching from Kenya in the east right across to West Africa. Camel-borne libraries are very popular because the camels can take books to the most remote village and exchange them. Now, you may wonder what has an African donkey got to do with innovation? Well, it turns out that the conservation of donkeys is a serious issue in East Africa. Donkeys are a vital part of the livelihood of villages and people who live on rural farms. But the Chinese have found that there are certain components in the meat and flesh and skin of donkeys which have medicinal purposes. So they have, with the permission of East African governments, set up slaughterhouses where hundreds of thousands of donkeys have been slaughtered and their meat and hide are sent to the Far East. Fortunately, some countries such as Kenya have got wise to this and have closed down those butcheries, but some very innovative techniques are now being used to rebreed the donkey, to stock them again, and to protect them from overexploitation. There are many examples around Africa of how modern technology is being used to promote basic agriculture. And here's the founders of an app called Farm Crowdy, which basically shared information with rural farmers, small-scale rural farmers, on how to make optimal use of their land, of fertilizer, and particularly to link venture capitalists with small farmers who have a likelihood of succeeding. And this project, which was launched in Nigeria, is now thriving throughout West Africa and into East Africa. Beekeeping is also on the rise in Africa, and it's the encouragement of beekeeping, apiculture, is one of the positive consequences coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, because that pandemic was originally caused by bushmeat being exported from Africa to the Far East, and then the virus jumping to humans. And many agencies who work in rural communities in Africa are now trying to find other ways in which to employ or make people in rural areas economically viable without having to rely on bushmeat. And one of them is apiculture. And here we can see a company called Native Nosy, which is based in South Africa, whose aim is no less than to become the biggest beekeepers on the continent. Now, beehives are not only useful for producing honey, but in Zambia, they used to repel elephants from the maize fields, because the farmers found that elephants are particularly afraid of bees. I suppose a bee flying up your trunk isn't a very comfortable thing. And they even found that recordings of the humming of bees and more sophisticated, the pheromones released by bees can be used to repel elephants. Another interesting low-tech but effective innovation has taken place in northern Botswana, where the cattle farmers are suffering from predation by lions on their cattle. These lions come from the Moremi Game Reserve, and they may not be shot. So the farmers had to find another way of controlling predation. And they had noticed that there are many animals in the wild, including moths and butterflies and various mammals, that have eye-like patterns on them, which tend to repel predators. So in collaboration with an Australian university, they did a long-term experiment where they took about 1,800 head of cattle. 1/3 of them had eye spots painted on both sides of the rump. 1/3 had nothing painted on them, and 1/3 had simply a black cross painted on them. And after 3 years, they found that the cattle with eyes on the rump were not predated on at all. Those with no marking were predated at the normal rate, and those with a cross were predated at a slightly lower rate. There's another interesting innovation related to agriculture and farming. Jason and David Drew in the Agri-Protein project north of Cape Town are culturing on a massive scale the black soldier fly for its larvae, because they found that the larvae of this fly are particularly useful in the chicken farming industry and also in aquaculture and in mariculture. And they have effectively created the largest fly farms in the world and have expanded their enterprise into the Middle East, into the Americas, and also into Australia. I'm not going to mention a lot of South African inventions in this talk because they're covered in my other books and my other talks, but the few I do mention are ones that have had an impact throughout South Africa or throughout Africa. This is a cyber tracker invented by Louis Liebenberg, for which he's received many international awards. It's a palm-top computer with an icon-based interface, and he initially created it to document the knowledge of San hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari in South Africa and Botswana. And it was an extremely effective tool. And like all good inventions, it's now found application in many other fields. So it's used by field researchers, for instance, on amphibians. It's used by game rangers. It's used by foresters and a wide variety of people who have to collect information in the field. Now, Dr. Tony Watondi is a Kenyan. She grew up in a farm in rural Kenya. And she noticed that her father and her uncles were using traditional knowledge and their field observations to predict important things like when a drought is likely to occur, the time to plant seeds, to harvest the crop, etc. And while she had a great respect for the value of their indigenous knowledge, she realized that their predictions weren't as accurate as they could be. So she developed the Artiki app, which basically combines traditional knowledge and observations with modern meteorological data. She subsequently did her PhD at UCT on this topic and is currently employed in South Africa. And this app is now being widely applied by farmers in Africa. Here's an unusual one. Paula Ainsley and her husband, both biologists, were on holiday in a game reserve. When they were watching elephants and especially looking at elephant dung. And they realized that a great deal of the 100+ plants that elephants eat, the leaves, the twigs, the bark, and the flowers, are not digested. In fact, they subsequently found that something like 30% is digested and the rest remains undigested in the dung. And they thought, why not use elephants as a sort of method of collecting the botanicals that you can then use to flavor gin? So after consulting with experts, they have produced Ndlovu gin, which is flavored from elephant dung and has been a great success. Here's another interesting application of modern technology to basic farming. Henry Foretier is a chicken farmer in rural Cameroon, and he is located far from any veterinary services. So he created the Save the Chicken app, whereby if his chicken becomes diseased, he photographs the chicken or any diseased parts of it or its feces. And he also photographs the chicken coop and the food and sends that information to a vet. A vet then makes a diagnosis and sends it back to him, and Henry is then able to share that information with other chicken farmers. And this now has expanded into an app which promotes all aspects of efficient chicken farming. Turning to some nature conservation type innovations, I've recently spent quite some time in Zanzibar and visited the Chumbi Coral National Park off Zanzibar in Tanzania. And something that's very obvious there is the way in which coral is being exploited. There's a truckload of coral shown in the upper left picture. And as we know, coral takes thousands or even tens of thousands of years to form. And coral reefs are habitat for something like 25% of all species in the oceans. So they're extremely important organisms. And a peace worker and a development agency worker called Sybil Rittmiller noticed this problem when she was working in Zanzibar, and she looked for a place where she could establish a coral park. and found it at Chumbi Island, which was previously a military base, so it had not been visited by divers, and there are absolutely pristine reefs there. And through the help of the Tanzanian government, she's established this Coral Reef National Park, and there are active training programs to develop educators and to educate the Tanzanian people about the value of coral. And a byproduct of this project is, as shown in the bottom right there, is the giant coconut crab, the largest crab in Africa, which has virtually disappeared from the African mainland, is also conserved on Chumbi Island. Another example of innovation in marine research and conservation is the work at the Two Oceans Aquarium, especially by Mareka Mason and her team, where they have tagged a number of animals, including this loggerhead turtle called Yoshi, and then released Yoshi. And initially she swam up the west coast of Africa, and then made a decision that that was the wrong way to go. So came all the way back and then crossed the Indian Ocean. And she's now joined a colony of loggerhead turtles in northwest Australia. And in fact, the Australian scientists who are also following her progress discovered this new colony of loggerhead turtles as a result of Yoshi's journey. Our very own Kerry Sink made a very important contribution by establishing SASI, the South African Sustainable Seas Initiative. And I'm sure you've all come across it in restaurants, where it enables you to decide whether fish on the menu are being sustainably harvested. It's doubtful whether they're sustainably harvested, or they definitely should not be eaten. And this project arose when Kerry was still a student, working at Ori in Durban, and she subsequently developed it with the WWF, and it's been a wonderful success. Another example of marine conservation innovation is the Abalobi set of apps developed by Serge Rijemakers and his team at UCT. And this is a series of apps that allows traditional fishermen up the west coast of South Africa to document their catches, to manage their fishery, to properly manage the financial side of catching and selling fish. And it's been an absolute revelation for them. They now feel ownership of what they're doing and of their resource, and are harvesting it sustainably. And I think I can include the very innovative work we've done with Professor Dr. Hans Fricker from the Max Planck Institute in Germany on the coelacanth, specifically in the Comores, but he's also worked in Tanzania and off South Africa. And there you can see the Jago two-man submersible, which can go to 400 meters, with Jürgen Schauer and myself off the south coast of Grand Comore. And Jürgen and Karen Hissman have done remarkable things from the Jago, including removing scales from coelacanths for aging, even placing tags in them, because the coelacanth, although it's a predator, it's a very docile animal and allows you to approach up close. Elephants, as we know, can cause a great deal of damage, as been seen in the Kruger Park, in Moremi Game Reserve and elsewhere. And South African vets have recently developed a contraceptive which can restrict their breeding, and it can be applied with a dart, so there's no need to capture the animal. Another small but innovative invention is the bird flapper, developed jointly by Eskom and the Endangered Wildlife Trust. And this has a little solar panel on it, and it flaps back and forth and makes a noise which discourages birds from sitting on power lines. Moving further afield, recycling is a very important topic throughout Africa, and there are many people doing innovative things in this field. This is Isato Sise, who's the Gambia's recycling queen, in fact, arguably Africa's recycling queen, because she's totally revolutionized the repurposing of waste in Gambia, and her example is being followed elsewhere. So she not only encourages people to recycle material that can be reused, but has started a variety of industries whereby useful products are made from reusable waste. There's another project in that field, the dung beetle project in South Africa. This stunning dung beetle sculpture has been created, and it travels around South Africa with an education program on recycling, and also has a means of recycling various materials to make useful products. And in Kenya, the floppy expedition is based around a dhow whose hull is made entirely from blocks of polystyrene, from flip-flops and so on, which have been washed up on the beach, glued together in blocks, and then made into the hull of this ship, which plies up and down the coast of Kenya, promoting recycling. Dr. Wangari Maathai is a real hero of South African forestry and botany, the first woman in East Africa to receive a PhD, a Nobel Prize winner for peace. And her tree planting campaign totally revolutionized conservation in East Africa and has led to other initiatives such as the Great Green Wall Initiative, whereby trees are being planted all along the Sahel from west to east in order to reduce the effects of desertification. Now, moving on to more technological things. One South African invention that I have written and talked about before that I'd like to mention again is the remarkable tellurometer invented by Trevor Wadley, who I rate as South Africa's greatest inventor, if we exclude Elon Musk. Wadley was a world-class expert in radio, and bottom right, you can see the Barlow-Wadley radio prototype that he developed, and his radios were adopted worldwide for commercial and also personal use. But his most important invention was the tellurometer, which for nearly 30 years was the most accurate distance measuring device in the world. And among other things, the entire road and rail network of Kenya was mapped out surveyed and mapped out using a tellurometer, and that applies to several other African countries as well. And the Cabora Bassa Dam was also surveyed in Mozambique using a tellurometer. And here's the full range of tellurometers made by a company called Tellumat Plessy in Cape Town, which earned massive foreign earnings for South Africa. The radio tellurometers invented by Wadley on the top row, and an even more accurate tellurometer invented by another South African, De Kolscher, the infrared tellurometer, shown along the bottom row. Another high-tech invention that has now been adopted worldwide is the CAT scanner, 3D X-ray machine, and it was developed on the basis of the initial work by South Africa's first nuclear physicist, Alan Cormack, from UCT, who was working at Groote Schuur Hospital on X-ray dosages and radioactive material in treatment of patients. And he developed the algorithms and the prototype, which you can see in front of him there, for the CAT scanner. He didn't have the means to take it to the market, but that was done by Godfrey Hounsfield, who worked for EMI in England, and between them, they won the Nobel Prize for physiology and medicine as a result of their invention. And interestingly, the CAT scanner is rated as the 53rd greatest invention of all time, and it's the only invention from the Southern Hemisphere in the top 100. Like all great inventions, the CAT scanner has led to other important innovations. This one, LODOX, low-dose X-ray, was developed by De Beers to, as they said, reduce the risk of miners using diamonds as a dietary supplement. In other words, to stop miners from swallowing diamonds in order to steal them. But the LODOX has in fact proved to be extremely useful in emergency rooms in hospitals for a very quick X-ray, 3D X-ray of a patient who's been injured. So like the CAT scanner, they've been adopted worldwide in hospitals as well. And then even more recently, Kit Vaughan of Cape Town, ex-Rhodes University, has developed the Akeso breast imaging system through his company, Cape Ray, and that is also a world leader. Now, we're all familiar with the wind-up radios, initially developed by Trevor Bayliss in England, but taken much further by the Free Play company in South Africa. And they produce a series of radios as well as torches and cell phone chargers. And once again, this invention has been taken further by Professor Dave Woods and his team to make wind-up medical equipment, such as a pulse oximeter on the left and the fetal heart rate monitor on the right. And these have revolutionized treatment and monitoring of patients in rural areas where electricity and batteries are scarce. Brian Gitter, I'll give his story in quite a lot of detail, the enormous challenges he had to face in order to develop this treatment, this diagnosis for malaria without having to take a blood sample. His is a remarkable and very typical story of the kind of perseverance that one has to have in order to successfully bring a product to the market. Sandile Ngopo was a PhD student working under Professor Phillips at the CSIR. Sandile was from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and he was working in a laboratory where they had both laser and hologram equipment. And he was the first to produce a three-dimensional laser, something that major laboratories around the world have been endeavoring to do for decades. And this 3D laser has proved to have many applications in different industries. In Johannesburg, Backchain, David Twomey, he's revolutionized the field of robotics in South Africa, and his robots have become famous for the many applications in different industries. Another well-known name is Lucky Netshizati, who had parents who were both deaf and dumb, and he couldn't communicate with them, so he developed these talking gloves that convert sign language into voice and text and vice versa. In the agricultural field, a company in Cape Town, which is now making an impact throughout the continent, is Aerobotics, who use very sophisticated drones to photograph plants in order to determine the condition of the plants, and not only of whole trees, but of individual leaves. And this work is reaching unprecedented levels of sophistication. The COVID pandemic led to a number of innovations, or the acceleration of innovation, and a company in Tunis City, Tunisia, Innova Robots, developed this P-Guard robotic policeman, which could patrol the streets when curfews were on and ask people who were walking around to show their curfew papers, which are then photographed, and the photograph was sent back to the headquarters. And there were even robots operating in some hospitals in Cape Town during the pandemic. Drones are now extensively used in Africa, and Zipline, which is an American company, has opened a branch in Ghana, which is led by Daniel Marfo. And Daniel is apparently a very innovative individual who's taken the drones to a whole new level. They were mainly used during the pandemic to fly out vaccines and medicines to rural areas, but Zipline has been extremely successful and is now developing throughout West Africa. And just while we're on COVID, this is a coronavirus hairstyle that was developed for young girls in Nairobi. And the whole idea behind it is that they found in Kenya that the adults weren't taking the COVID pandemic nearly as seriously as the children. The children, through their schooling, had learned to understand what it was all about, and they used these hairstyles to emphasize to their parents that this is something really serious. Solar panels and alternative energy, of course, have been in the forefront of innovation in Africa. And this is just one project developed in Cape Town at Stellenbosch, the Solar Turtle project, with different size solar panel industries being developed. Mulala Duyoyo is one of our serial inventors. He spent time in the USA, and like a lot of African inventors, he looks at how to solve problems in rural areas, and also how to make use of waste products and turn them into something useful. So he's developed Sinocell cementless concrete, and he's also developed Amori Guard, which is a very resilient paint for the outside walls of houses and the tiles on roofs. But he's also gone high-tech by developing a Fambani hydrogen motorbike and the biaxial universal testing machine. Another example of a great local inventor, Siubulela Kuza, originally known as our rocket man, because he rocketed to fame through the development of rocket fuels and won a number of expo competitions, and is now also working in the field of reusable materials. In the field of architecture, there are many examples of brilliantly innovative architecture throughout Africa. This is a Dorsi hut in Ethiopia. Although it is made from plant fibers, they are made in such a way that they last for decades. But a more high-tech solution has been found in Morocco, where the people in the high mountains of Morocco have traditionally cultivated hemp. And up until recently, they mainly sold the hemp to drug dealers, but this was fraught with problems. And a German architect has now worked with them to take the products from hemp, compress it, and make it into building material. Now, I'd like to mention a little bit about motor cars. The very first production motor car made in South Africa was by John Myers and his team back in 1956, the Protea shown here. Shortly afterwards, the Flamingo and the Dart were developed. And then more recently, the brilliant dual South African e-car was invented, but sadly, it never went into commercial production. Now, we've also, through SAMIL, the South African military vehicles, developed a range of military vehicles which have been sold internationally. Perhaps the most famous is the Casper. And another recent innovation in the transport field is the HISA hydrogen-powered forklift, developed by Hydrogen South Africa in collaboration with the DSI and various universities. In Richards Bay, the Bell Trucks company has developed a range of world-class haulage vehicles for road building and forestry and agriculture applications. And they really are at the forefront of this field internationally. And on an even larger scale, this is Anglo-American's monster 2-megawatt hydrogen hybrid truck with a 290-ton payload per truck. Now, while I was doing research for this book, I went to a meeting of the Crank Handle Club in Cape Town, which is a club of sort of petrol heads who are very knowledgeable about cars and vehicles. And I asked them, how many vehicles have been invented in other African countries? And the only one they could come up with was Yuri Desert Runner, which was a four-wheel drive vehicle originally developed in Namibia, but which is now made in South Africa. So I decided to look a bit deeper, because I couldn't believe that no other African countries have made vehicles. And I was amazed by what I found. And just to quickly go through them, and I must emphasize, many of these African vehicles were government projects which weren't particularly economically viable and continue to be subsidized for national pride purposes, but some of them have in fact commercially succeeded. This is Kantaka from Ghana, a sophisticated urban four-wheel drive. Mobius Motors, once again, four-wheel drives from Kenya. Wally's car, a rather odd name, from Tunisia, the Kira range from Uganda, more upmarket vehicles, Inasan from Nigeria, and even Madagascar has produced some vehicle called the Karenje Mazana. A Karenje means to stroll along slowly, so I gather it's not a very fast vehicle, but at least they've taken it to the market. And I find it extraordinary that other than those early short production run Protea, Dart and Flamingo, and our SAML vehicles and our recent hydrogen powered commercial vehicles, that South Africa has not developed a single car, bus or taxi that has gone onto the international market. But my favorite vehicle invented in Africa is the one shown on the cover of my book. And this vehicle was made in the remarkable Sumi magazine, which is probably the largest car parts scrapyard in Africa. It's in Accra in Ghana, where there are about 30,000 different shops selling motorcar bits. And two foreigners actually from Europe saw this Swami magazine, and they worked with the local parts dealers, got government subsidy, and they created the turtle truck, which is made from the parts of different vehicles, so it cannot be sold internationally, but certainly is finding use in Ghana. So the turtle truck has become a kind of symbol of the can-do attitude of African innovation, and recently was displayed alongside Elon Musk's latest electric car in California, just to show the contrasting styles. Moving on to financial matters, M-Pesa, of course, was invented in Kenya. We don't know exactly who the inventor was, but it was probably someone associated with Safaricom. And I speculate that at one stage when Safaricom called for ideas on the development of their product, and they received a proposal from a student, that proposal was followed up, but we will never know who the ultimate inventor was. But M-Pesa was well ahead of the international field in terms of the use of cell phones for financial transactions, and Kenya is still one of the most advanced countries in the world in this regard. And here are just a few other examples of financial app innovations that have been made in South Africa and elsewhere in Africa. I haven't touched on our high-tech industries. Sunsat was launched by NASA on a Delta II rocket in 1999, developed at the University of Stellenbosch, directly as a result of the inspiration of hearing the tick, tick, tick of Sputnik going overhead. Was one of the first microsatellite produced in South Africa. And since then, many have been produced, and we really are very advanced in that field. Also, our joint astronomy projects, SKA and SALT, within them have a massive number of innovations. The only one I'm going to mention is the SKA Reconfigurable Application Board, SCARAB, which, typical of this project, has been designed in such a way that it constantly can be reconfigured as new discoveries are made and new questions are asked and new investigations are initiated. Once again, when I asked people in the general science community how many African countries have space programs, they basically said, well, maybe one or two other than South Africa. Well, in fact, 19 African states have national space programs. Many of them are confined to the production and launching of satellites which look back at Earth to monitor environmental events and agricultural production and so on, but they nevertheless do represent space programs. But perhaps the most remarkable high-tech project in Africa is the so-called Internet in the Sky, balloon-suspended internet towers in Kenya. They're fitted with solar panels, and they place in geostationary orbit at an altitude of about 20 kilometers. And the reason why Kenya went this route is in the Great Rift Valley and elsewhere in Kenya, they're very mountainous regions where it's difficult to erect land-based cell phone towers, so they went this route. And the most remarkable aspect of this project is these delicate balloons, instead of packing them up and couriering them to Kenya, they actually flew them there. They flew them there from California, and then they were fitted out, and they're now hovering in the sky, providing internet access. In my book, I mentioned the achievements of many African entrepreneurs and techpreneurs who are hardly known outside of their countries. Nawal El-Sadawi, who's a famous physician, psychiatrist, and women's health advocate. Rachel Sabandi from Malawi, a social entrepreneur who developed their first technology hub, MHub, and several programs that promote the involvement of girls and women in technology, such as Girl Effect Malawi. Agnes Kalibo, who initiated the AGRA project, following in the footsteps of Wangari Maathai, and that project has greatly stimulated the development of smallholder farming throughout East Africa. Our regional director for Africa from WHO, she was really the spokesperson for the COVID-19 campaign throughout Africa and did a marvelous job in that regard. Dr. Elizabeth Rasakola, who's a trained engineer, is also a pioneer now based in England, but working throughout Africa in promoting STEM. And then we need to acknowledge also the fact that some of the major industrialists in Africa, such as Aliko Dangote, Africa's richest businessman, who's pivotal in developing the oil industry, he has also strongly promoted entrepreneurship and the development of science and science education, as has Tony Elumelu, the chairman of the United Bank for Africa and founder of his own foundation. And I'd also like to acknowledge Lakshmi Mittal, who is founder of ArcelorMittal, the giant steel company. He's originally from India, but has a very advanced ideas on how science can be developed, especially among young people. And in South Africa has established 2 interactive science centers at Saldanha and up in the Northern Free State. I'd like to end by talking a little bit more about why I think this is Africa's century and Africa will be the bright continent. Dr. Klaus Schwab, the real well-known economist, founder of the World Economic Forum, he's predicted that we're in the 4th industrial revolution. And although I agree with many of the comments that he made, and I'm nothing more than a retired fisherman, I'm not an economist, I don't agree with them that we're in the 4th industrial revolution. Let's just look. The first industrial revolution was the one that's starting in the late 1700s, powered by steam. The second one, the late 1800s, powered by electricity. The third one, the 3IR, nuclear energy, and characterized by electronics, telecoms, computers, synthetics. And then he is saying we're now in the 4IR with internet, robotics, AI, nanotech, quantum computing, etc. Now, there's no doubt that the technologies that have been developed have greatly benefited humankind, but they have not necessarily benefited the other inhabitants of our planet. And just a few stats here given by Peter Diamandis in his book Abundance. The human's lifespan has more than doubled, the cost of food is down, the cost of energy is down, transport and cost of communication. So it's been good for humans on the whole. And if we look at the benefits of the first 3 industrial revolutions, no doubt an improved quality of life for people, job creation, technological innovation, economic development, globalization, which is a 2-edged sword, advanced medical care, which allows us to live longer. But there have also been a great deal of harm done by those first three industrial revolutions, and we need to recognize that. Not only the human population explosion, but the population explosion of farm and domestic animals associated with humans and their impacts, materialistic cultures which have led to conspicuous consumption, wider society imbalances, major damage to the environment, the digital divide, global climate change, disruption to ecological processes, compromised life support systems, and the development of unsustainable lifestyles. So I argue that we are now in the first post-industrial revolution. And it's not just playing with words, because I think it requires us to realize that there's been a major change of mindset in the way we go about doing things. And I believe that this first post-industrial revolution is capable of undoing the wrongs of the first three industrial revolutions. And it's an opportunity to harness resources in an unprecedented way to solve global problems. So why is it the post-industrial revolution? Well, it's characterized by digital tools, disruptive technologies, some of which are forms of social intervention and even social domination. They facilitate technology transfers and leapfrogs, which allow people from developing countries to be part of it, and they have the effect of democratizing technology. And this was, in fact, previously predicted back in the 90s by the US military already, who proposed VUCA, which is characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And all of those predictions have come through in this first post-industrial revolution. And the key thing about it, of course, is the way in which the internet doesn't just connect us, it entangles us. 1 billion by 2005, 4.6 billion by 2022, more than half of all people, and massive participation, for instance, in Facebook. The other thing is the contribution by young people, the Generation X's, the millennials, and especially the Generation Z's, globally connected, digitally competent, entrepreneurial, ambitious, and self-authored. Another feature, and this is particularly strong in Africa, is we must recognize that there are two kinds of entrepreneurs. There are the commercial entrepreneurs who are typically for-profit loners. They work in opportunity-rich environments, maximize their profits, and often drive global trends. Whereas social entrepreneurs work in a completely different environment and mindset. They tend to be collaborative, they work in adverse environments, they generate social value as well as some profits, and they tend to plow those profits back, and they often are anti-global in their trending. And the internet, as I've said, it really is the big change, reaching so many people, most efficient communication medium ever, but it does deepen the digital divide, and it is threatened by various factors. And then, of course, it connects us with the Internet of Things and the Internet of Industrial Things, which is the first time humans have been connected with machines. So as a result of all this, science and technology now carried out by a multi-grained, multi-generational superorganism, which has a kind of collective genius and a group intelligence that makes it possible for us to co-create solutions for the most difficult problems facing our planet. We also need to recognize that the nature of inventions has changed from tangible devices to invisible, visible digital services, apps on smartphones and cloud-based services. And these serve the needs of totally new fields of endeavor and in fact create those new fields of endeavor. And they create ways of living sustainably and reduce the impact of technology. So technology is actually starting to turn on itself. So I argue in my book, this is not just another industrial revolution, it's a connecting, problem-solving post-industrial revolution. It will be driven by young people in developing continents and in particular in Africa. We need to take full advantage of the opportunities offered by it, and Africa has a particularly strong role to play. And another factor in favor of Africa is our so-called demographic dividend. This diagram shows the median ages in Africa, and you can see most of Africa, the median age is in the teens. So we've got a huge advantage over the old world elsewhere. And then to conclude, what is the spirit of innovation in Africa? Firstly, I think it's an important observation is that innovation is developed at all levels in Africa, not just at the high-tech level, but from low to medium to high-tech. And this effectively provides what I call a step ladder for advancement, where innovators can start at the low tech end and eventually progress to high-tech. It maximizes the advantages, the demographic dividend, and it's characterized by determined individuals who are unafraid of failure. Because many of our young people have been subject to failure and discrimination, especially girls, and they've learned to live with it, and they've learned to get up and start again and to fail quickly. The spirit of innovation in Africa also focuses on natural resources and social issues, and especially the problems faced by rural people and people in peri-urban townships. So, to confront all of these problems, we have a strong problem-solving work ethic. So I conclude that Africa is the bright continent. We've shown remarkable economic growth since 2000. We have some of the best performing economies in the world, but perhaps most importantly, we have rapid technology uptake and a very strong spirit of entrepreneurship. So if you want to read more about it, please go to my book, Harambee. It is on sale in all major bookshops around the country. It can be ordered from book distributors such as Booksite. And if you'd have trouble getting a hold of it, please contact me. My email address is given on the slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, for an absolutely fascinating talk. And let me just apologize if my sound has changed. I'm now working off our UPS system and it makes a little bit of noise. If anybody would like to ask any questions, please do just either put them into the chat or put your hand up and I will see. And I'm sure Mike would be prepared to answer one or two if there are any questions that anybody would like to ask or comments that anybody would like to make. Mike, I'm not actually seeing any right now, but I wanted to ask a question. You've covered many countries in Africa, and certainly the second part of your talk, which really did deal with connectivity and the internet and so on. We often hear the comment that Africa suffers from a lack of connectivity or a lack of communication between countries, a lack of capacity to have enough bandwidth, if you like. And yet you've given us so many different examples. Do you think that that concern is true, that we do suffer from a lack of connectivity and insufficient bandwidth?
I think it was true in the past, but it's changing very quickly. But, there's still no doubt an axis of communication that's very strong from African countries to European countries and universities and research institutes, and also to North America and the Far East, especially Korea and Japan. The amount of inter-Africa communication is increasing, and the undersea cables that are now connecting us more and more effectively are going to help, as are the ballooned cell phone towers in Kenya, which will no doubt be introduced elsewhere. So I think it is improving, but we need to work more closely within Africa instead of seeing our main stimulation coming from the Northern Hemisphere, from Europe and North America. And in my research for this book and in discussions with South African scientists and innovators, I have found that they are trying harder than ever to communicate and collaborate with their colleagues elsewhere in Africa, but they do admit that their main axes of collaboration have not been within Africa.
Yeah, thank you. That's certainly my experience. There's two comments in the chat box. The one, let me just address the last one first, about this being posted to YouTube for others to watch. It has been recorded, and we will certainly have it on our website, and we can, I'm sure, put it onto YouTube, because it certainly has been very comprehensive and fascinating. Mike, there's one other question, and that is from Leslie Cornish, saying, what about the effects of corruption? Do you have a comment on that?
Effects of corruption. Well, yeah, I think the main effect of corruption is at how it paralyzes an economy and reduces the opportunity for many people to be active in the economy, because the amount of money that's siphoned off or, you know, doesn't remain in the system for use for the purposes for which it was originally created. And I think we've definitely suffered from that in South Africa, and it's a problem in Nigeria and a number of other African states. And also, you know, related to that is misinformation and pseudoscience and anti-science sentiments, all of which can be harmful to the progress of science and technology. The COVID pandemic, you know, the way that Madagascar and Tanzania, for instance, dealt with that, it was a disaster for their people. And you know, we need to realize that all of these things are undermining the progress of science and technology and attempts to improve the quality of life of people.
Thank you. And would you like to just address this next one, which is to speculate on whether innovation and technology might contribute to slowing human population growth?
Okay, well, that is a big challenge in Africa, because having a big family is something that's sort of a traditional insurance for old age. And education to me is the main tool there. And, you know, educating people about why it's better to have fewer children who will have a higher quality of life, you know, is so vitally important. But I've been quite impressed in my research on how effective organizations like the World Health Organization and other medical organizations that are spreading their message in Africa. And I think we are starting to turn the corner in terms of the human population explosion, because that still remains one of the biggest issues that we're facing. And as I mentioned, it's not only the humans, but their domestic and farm animals. The impact that they're having on the environment is something that we need to factor in as well.
Indeed. Well, I think we've reached the end of the questions and comments, and it has been absolutely fascinating. So it remains for me to say thank you very much indeed, Mike, for this wonderful talk, and for the amazing wealth of information that you've given us, and to encourage everybody to read your book, of course. But as Sandra has just said in the chat box, so good to hear so much positive information about Africa. So thank you to you, Mike. Thank you to everybody who has listened. And we wish everybody a good evening and well over the load shedding. So thank you so much, Mike. And thank you to everybody. And let us say good evening and enjoy the rest of your evening.